with a bow tie in Chattanooga, Tennessee, David Tulis.
You know that you can't be arrested in Tennessee for not showing your ID, not showing your identification. You can avoid arrest and be allowed to sign a citation if you give your identification. That's in a statute. The Tennessee Code Annotated says that when any police or peace officer asks the violator for identification for the purpose of issuing a citation or a civil warrant to that person, the failure to produce or give such identification shall be grounds for the violator to be arrested. All right, so if you're not giving your ID because you are already under arrest and face arrest or face a citation, you can satisfy the law by giving your ID. Now, notice the statute has two words. It has the words produce or give. Now, those are two different actions. Produce is when you clearly have something that you're giving. So that would be a card, a concealed carry permit, a driver license, or something else. Or give. And giving, for the purpose of a citation, is simply stating your name, your legal address, and I believe your date of birth. That is sufficient to have you be able to sign, be handed that citation to appear in sessions or city court, and to be sent on your way because you've agreed by legally identifying yourself under the penalty of the False Statement Act. You're making a true statement, and you are stating who you are under the threat of punishment of that other act. So you don't have to have an actual document to avoid being arrested. Right? The citation system in Tennessee and Chattanooga is under the actions in lieu of arrest, and that there's a statute for that says that when the officer violates an ordinance or any traffic regulation that belongs to, meaning has been adopted by a municipal, metropolitan, or city government in the presence of a law enforcement officer, he can issue a citation and have the violator's agreement to show up in court. And so you don't have to have a physical document to be free of arrest. You just simply have to truthfully state your identification, to identify yourself legally in a legally binding way, because to not identify yourself legally correctly or accurately is a crime. I think it's a misdemeanor offense to make a false statement. So you give your identification, name, address, and date of birth, and you should satisfy the requirements under the law. And also something I just want to mention, Rule 5, just in case you're ever caught up with the police. Rule 5 in the Tennessee Code of Procedure, there's a book that has that. I don't have a current copy of it, but Rule 5 requires the officer to take you immediately before a magistrate. In other words, before you're taken into the system, before you're arrested, booked, fingerprinted, have your mugshot made so that it will appear on Just Busted, you have a right to see a magistrate first, right? To evaluate the charges against you, and you can have a hearing right then before you're taken into the system. You have a procedural right to have a judicial review, and the reason is because you've been arrested without a warrant, right? You've been arrested without there being a warrant for your arrest, and so that magistrate who acts as a judge has occasion and gives you the occasion to review the charges against you. Well, this is David Tulis, and you think I'm going into details here, but it is a detail, and it doesn't affect you at all. But I think it's important to stimulate in you, my listener, an interest in these questions, because if we live in a free country and have the fruits of a free market, which we do have, and are free people, which we tell ourselves in public schools that we are, then these things are important. They are, you might say, part of the didactic purpose of my show here. David Tulis at Nooga Radio 92.7 FM. I really thank you for giving me just a minute of your time. But you have a right to a magistrate. This right is widely abused. And to maintain yourself, to maintain your the protections for yourself, it's good to have some of these things in mind, because you never know when it's going to happen, and suddenly you're in the middle of a nightmare. That nightmare is a confrontation with the state, and suddenly you're swimming way over your head. You're dealing with officers. You're in the back of a cruiser. You've been handcuffed. There's some claim against you. You don't understand it. It could be that someone has committed a fraud in using your name and using your identity, and has defrauded a department store $5,000 of bikini underwear and men's boots, and you now are facing arrest because that claim has been made against you, and you are wanted. Right, you're a wanted person because someone fraudulently used your ID. The ID being the avatar that we all agree to have for our convenience. But which is the legal ID. It is the means by which we become visible to government and civil government and corporations. So think of the problem some people have when they're invisible to government and invisible to corporations. There are complaints about that among some courts. The quarter, and I'm thinking now of a Texas teenager who was in her 19s and I guess became 20 years old, left home. The daughter of an attorney that I wrote about at Nooganomics.com, and she was complaining about having been the fruit of a homeschool family who didn't even have a birth certificate. So somehow she didn't really exist, and she was complaining about not being able to get credit, not being able to get a driver license, being inhibited in efforts to perhaps attend a public college, right, with a subsidized education. And so she was saying, well, I'm not a real person if I don't have an ID. The ID, of course, is the avatar, the handle through which you are controlled, and through which you, my listener, and you and your family members make magic. It is a magical thing to have an avatar with many benefits. You can rent a car. If you have a credit card, you can rent a car. If you don't have a credit card, well, it's almost impossible to rent one in commerce. So we look at the ID as something strange and mysterious, and the exercise of the magic power of credit is certainly something to marvel at. We have to understand that while this system is still in place, we should just be amazed at the innovation behind it, at the ingenuity behind it. Well, I really appreciate your giving me a couple minutes of your time. I brought up this question yesterday in a somewhat passionate conversation with a son about himself. We'd heard a sermon that made reference to the purpose-driven life, and so I tried to take from what we heard and asked him about his sweet spot, because that had been mentioned in the life of the Christian. How can you serve other people? How can you extend God's grace to other people in your sweet spot? The sweet spot is your area of gift, your area of strength, the thing that makes you passionate. So I asked this young man who's 14, as we traveled in our van home to lunch, what is your sweet spot? What do you really care about? How can we take what God has given you in the way of character and gifts and background, and have you explore new areas? Have you become useful to people? Have you engage yourself in activities or ministries or nonprofit organization work or volunteer work or other that would use your gifts for God's glory and the benefit of other people? And he's not sure, but in that conversation, which trailed afterwards past the lunch hour, where we sat with my mother, 93, who kept saying, as she says repeatedly every day, how amazing the sky is. It's always blue here. And in Switzerland, she was remembering her girlhood days. In Switzerland, the weather's always bad. She kept insisting. She's always insisted on that as being true. Though sometimes I gently say, well, Mom, I lived in Lausanne for 2 years, and it was usually very sunny and bright weather. She looks at me mystified. Can't quite believe that that's true, and that her statements repeated 10 times a day might be not true. So of course, I don't ever insist on that. I just let that go. Past that lunch hour where we sat, the conversation continued in the front room with this boy sitting in our very uncomfortable great red chair by the window facing the front porch. And I brought up this matter about about this distinction between produce and give. And I said, well, son, don't you think that that's important, that there's that distinction, and that if you know that, if you, my son, know that you have something that other people don't have, don't you think that you have an advantage being my son? Don't you believe that the things that I say that you think I'm droning on about may really have a value? Doesn't that put you in an advantageous place to always be in my house, to be constantly hearing things in this direction? And he finds my discourse tedious. Okay, I'm glad you, my listener, don't think that what I have to say is tedious. And I do thank you, my one listener. You're the man who matters. I'm glad that you've given me just a few minutes of your time, and think with me through the problems that we are facing. As a country, we're facing these problems. In our families, we're facing these problems, and also in Chattanooga, which, as we are reading in the Chattanooga Times Free Press, has had a great momentum toward cohesion, toward city's purpose, and then has all of which seems to have collapsed most recently. It's a very fine piece of writing. It's long-term journalism with a long-term view, and that, the fact that we have reports like that in the Chattanooga Times Free Press is a reason to subscribe to the paper, right? You should support your local newspaper because it's local, right? It's local. It's here. And that staff is, even though there are some good liberal people on there, to investigate and study and report on things that are valuable for you. Right? This is my competition. I say these things not worrying about competition, because my own labors as an entrepreneur are neither hindered nor advanced by their very fine labors to maintain market share in the media. So it's a good story. So in this city, we have these questions about the future. We have the questions about the sweet spot of young people. Where can you find God's grace? Where can you work to further your knowledge, further your gifts, and exercise yourself? My sweet spot, as I explained, is really things about liberty, things about the marketplace, things about the sweet spot that I have is talking with you, my listener, how we can do better, right? How we can do better. And part of that is being confident in God's grace, being confident in the idea of progress. Lost the idea of progress, and I say that because it affects me. It grieves me as a Christian deacon in the Presbyterian Church. It grieves me that Christianity has become so slack and so irrelevant. Now, Christianity is highly relevant, of course, to the individual soul, whom it confesses Christ as his Savior. As I was chatting with my son, these points came up. I said, well, my gifts are in these areas, and which the son thinks are very dry, Dad, not very useful to me here at 14. And so I said, well, I understand that, but I want you to take advantage of me. I want you to use what I have to say and just think with me through these problems, because when you become a 20-year-old man and you're in commerce, you're in the marketplace, making a living, running a company, maybe being an employee of a business, these things will be important to you, and you have them. If you have them now, you can build on them later, right? If you have the basic ideas of law, the basic ideas of liberty, the fundamentals of self-assertion, the confident self-assertion of the Christian man, you'll be able to help people in the future in ways you can't imagine now. And so I was essentially begging him to think and to rethink his dad's role and the way his dad feels silent. I don't like sitting there silently. If I'm traveling somewhere with a son or a daughter, I want conversation, or I want them to listen to what I have to say, or I want to listen to a good lecture, right? And that's what we do. Silence, of course, is good for contemplation. I'm not against silence per se, but I want there to be good things to think about. And so the question of the idea of producing your ID, you can produce your ID or give it. So you're not bound to have one. So here we have effectively a defense for the free traveler, the Hispanic person, the hard-nosed constitutionalist who refuses to drive, but who instead travels by right on the public right-of-way because he's not in commerce, he's not a common carrier for hire. Poor people who don't have driver's licenses, poor people who can't afford the fines to get their revoked drivers unrevoked. I mean, people who are, who should be making the defense that I'm not in commerce, right? They're not in commerce, and so whether the fact that they have a revoked license is irrelevant, because at that moment they're not in commerce. If they were in commerce, having a revoked license would be a ban on use of the road, right? Because then they would be driving, they would be operating a motor vehicle. Those things are all terms describing commercial activity. But a private person using his car or truck privately, not in commerce, there's no requirement. And so the revocation of a driver's license is not an offense. It's not an injury to the state. I would argue that's a possible defense. And well, okay, the question about this, the question from the Sun. Let me get to something I wanted to mention on this point. At a church we visited yesterday, I asked an elder, does your fellowship have anyone in it who cares about prisons or cares about inmates, courts, or abuses of people by the court system, the so-called justice system? And he said, well, yes, we have some connection with Transformation Project, which has advisors for people who are already in the system, and it encourages them to live a godly life, to repent, to love the Lord Jesus, to live a godly life, and abstain from the activities which perhaps got them into trouble in the first place with the law. And he mentioned another ministry as well. And I said, when's the last time your minister preached about prisons and the fact that prisons are ungodly and anti-Christian? He had not heard that before. And he said, well, I've been here 7 years, and I've never heard a sermon on prisons. And, you have 52 weeks a year, so 7 times 52 is 350 sermons, prospects, assuming one per Sunday. 350 sermons, not one on prisons. Though the prison system and the judicial industrial complex in Chattanooga is a machine that grinds up the poor and the ignorant and the hapless and the disorganized and the people who just can't make things happen. Right? They're always the people who are always being interrupted from their goals by bad things happening, cars breaking down, borrowing cars, not getting licenses renewed, not paying fines, not making a court date for some misdemeanor charge. These are the people who the machine grinds up into powder, right? Grinds to powder. And I said, well, the scriptures don't allow for prison. The scriptures have two systems of government through the civil magistrate. One is execution for capital offenses, and the other is restitution. There is no prison. Prison, I suggested, interrupts the divine plan for justice. It interrupts the victim's rights. The victim cannot collect the compensation due to him for the crime committed against him. The man who's done the crime is in prison waiting for 10 years, 15 years, maybe a life sentence like the Holly Bobo killer gets life plus 50 years. He deserves death, of course, and there's no reason to put him in prison. He deserves the death penalty, according to God, right? According to God, murder is a capital offense, and it should be swiftly done in public with the witnesses casting the first stone. That it should be a public event. It should be a public spectacle. That's what the scriptures require. And so, if you're a Christian, these should be part of what you understand to be God's limit on men's opinions and men's devisings in the way of criminal justice and jurisprudence, right? Well, the man said, well, I said, well, how come? This is an important part of our life today. The whole prison, courts, policing, that's all a very strong part of American life. Why have we not heard have you not heard a sermon about that? He said, well, I guess it's just not a priority. I said, I guess not. And so, here's another church that I don't think I could find a good home in working on these issues and thinking through these issues and trying to learn about them. However, I did do some self-improvement this weekend. I read about half of an important book, Victims' Rights, by Gary North, The Biblical View of Civil Justice in the Biblical Viewpoint series. It came out in 1990, and from the Institute for Christian Economics, which explains the biblical analysis. But to care about that, you have to have some presuppositions already in line. You care about that. You preach on that if you believe God cares about the larger world. I think Christians who are responsible for our malaise, because Christians haven't connected their walks in life with their professing document, right? Their authoritative document, because they reject many parts of it. They think somehow that we have prisons because that's just the way things are. Somehow that they arrived by chance. By chance and human effort, we have these systems, and they're there. They are neutral. Somehow we think they're neutral. They're not Christian or anti-Christian. Well, listen, there is no neutrality. Either prisons are lawful in God's mind and lawful in God's God's world, and he preaches it in the Bible. Okay, he preaches that prisons are right, true, and good, and just in the Bible, or he doesn't. And if he doesn't, and he preaches an alternative system in the books of the Bible, then guess what? They're anti-Christian. And I'd say they're anti-Christian because they prevent the victim from attaining and obtaining compensation. You have to believe, if you're a Christian, you have to believe in victims' rights. The rights of the victim for compensation, either through payment or servitude of the perpetrator. That's what happens. You have a personal servitude in view, according to this detailed study. It's a short version of a longer study in another book by North that runs past 1,000 pages called Tools of Dominion. I've got that too, and I've read big chunks of it. David Tulis, working towards self-improvement and hoping that you can join me in the ride. David Tulis, Nooga Radio.